Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I need to start off with an apology. I am not at my best. Apart from carrying a mild cough and cold, I've also been, less than 18 hours ago, I was hurtling through my constituency in Thiruvananthapuram at the eye of a cyclone. We had, unfortunately, a couple of hundred of our fishermen who have been lost at sea during something called Cyclone Oki. Which hasn't made world headlines, but unfortunately, as you can imagine, as a member of parliament for that part of the country, that's been consuming my attention. And there were strong risks until quite late last evening that the flight I would have had to take to come to you might never even have landed in Thiruvananthapuram because of the cyclone. Anyway, all's well that more or less ends well. I say more or less because we still don't have word of all the missing fishermen. Some have been found. But I'm here, somewhat jet-lagged, having flown through the night, and therefore somewhat the worse for wear. But what I would like to do is give you a talk that perhaps may be slightly briefer than Alice had in mind, in order to leave more time for a Q&A exchange. It's a lovely auditorium, and great to see all of you in this intimate space. At the same time, of course, we're talking about a subject that is so vast that in any talk, there'd be a lot I'd leave out. So the more time I leave for Q&A, the more the possibility that we'll get to address the questions in your mind rather than my trying to answer all of your questions in an overlong talk. The book I'm here to talk to you about is called, in its British edition, Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. It was published a few months earlier in India under the perhaps more prosaic title, An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. But it boils down to both the same thing, that in fact the book is identical. The two titles are the only thing that's different. Plus, the Indian edition has lakhs and crores when the British one has millions and billions, but otherwise it's the same book. And the argument is very simple. It started off somewhat unusually, as a speech. I mean, now I'm making a speech about a book, but the book was actually following a speech I delivered at the Oxford Union at a debate in 2015, the summer of 2015, on a topic the students had chosen for the Oxford Union debate. And the topic they had chosen was, do come to my rescue. Thank you so much, Kula. Much appreciated. Thank you. Sorry, I need some hot liquid to lubricate me as I go along. And the topic they'd chosen was that Britain owes reparations to her former colonies. I'm not a big fan of reparations, and I'll explain why in a minute, but I took the topic as an opportunity to talk about British colonialism, about the balance sheet, as it were, of damage that was done to my country. And the reason that the debate was actually global, not just about India, the reason I focused on India in that debate was because it's the country I happen to know best. I've studied some Indian history, and though I'm very much an amateur historian with no professional credentials beyond a PhD many, many moons ago, I've always kept up an engagement and an interest in the subject, and so that's what I wanted to address. Now, it so happened that the debate went very well. We won hands down. And then a couple of weeks later, the Oxford Union posted on YouTube the speeches we'd all made, fortunately as individual speeches. And mine somehow went viral. It captured the imagination of a lot of viewers. And we had the most astonishing thing that within 24 hours, something like 3 million people had viewed it. It's since then been downloaded countless times elsewhere. And it created a great sense of almost passionate excitement at all levels of the Indian polity, so much so that my Indian publisher called me and said, look, you've got to make a book out of this. And I said, but why bother? Everyone knows this, surely. And he said, no, they don't, because if they already knew it, your speech wouldn't have gone viral, which seemed to make sense. So I agreed to make a book of it. But of course, the kind of slightly off-the-cuff kind of remarks one makes in a student debate, on the one hand, and the kind of research one needed to do for a substantive, as it turned out, 300-odd page book is something else. And for me, the challenge of vindicating my views through substantiating what I knew, both through looking up facts and figures and references that I believed I remembered from my student days, but I wanted to reconfirm, also needed to be supplemented by checking out what was the state of the art, as it were, in historical scholarship at some of the top universities which look at this subject. And so the book is a somewhat more, shall we say, substantive version of the speech. Like the speech, it is not a narrative history. It is an argument. Like the speech, it's a fairly passionate argument. Like the speech, it makes a case in indictment. And to some degree also, like the speech, it ducks the issue of reparations. In the speech, because I was supposed to be moving the motion that Britain owes reparations, I couldn't entirely get away from it, but I said, I don't particularly believe in financial reparations, because how do you put a value on the human lives lost, for example, because of British colonialism? The 35 million Indians who died totally unnecessary deaths in famines engineered by British policy, and all the other wrongs. So I said, you really can't put a price on it. Why don't you instead look for moral atonement or moral reparation, and pay a symbolic £1 a year for the next 200 years to make up for the last 200. That was the argument I took in the debate. In the book, the frame is not about reparations. It's about looking at what the case is. But I have tried to make the point in the book and in subsequent talks about it that moral atonement is the best one can hope for when one does a reckoning of this in the 21st century. Certainly financial reparations will become impossible. In fact, when my speech became so popular, an Indian journalist sat down and calculated what he believed would be the sums owed. And he based himself on a lot of material that exists about, for example, the systematic loot and draining of Indian revenues and resources to Britain by the British, as well as quantifying the value of the lives lost and so on. He came up with a sum so astonishing, about £3 trillion, that it amounted to the entire GDP of the UK, and no one was going to be able to pay that. So my argument was finances are simply not the way to go. But what is the moral reparation that needs to be paid? And I'll come back to that. I will leave that thought hanging there, because I'll first tell you a little bit about why there is atonement required, and end by telling you what I think that atonement should be. So why is there atonement required? Britain came to a flourishing, thriving, prosperous country and systematically set about ruining it. And I say this quite bluntly because, obviously the experience of British colonialism varies from place to place. Singapore is a lovely country, but was basically a barren rock when the British took it over. They built it using a lot of penal Indian labor, by the way. Their experience in Singapore, for example, can't be compared to their experience in India. But in India, you had a country which was by far the richest country on earth at that time. Accounting, according to the Oxford econometrician Angus Madison, for 27% of global GDP at the time. In 1700, 27%. By 1800, China was slightly higher, but India was still managing 23% of global GDP. It had a flourishing economy. India had been for 2,000 years the world's leading manufacturer and exporter of textiles. And that really does go back 2,000 years. So there are records have survived of debates in the accounts of Pliny the Elder, debates in the Roman Senate, which demonstrated that Roman senators were complaining about how much of Rome's gold was ending up in India because of the taste of Roman women 2,000 years ago for Indian linens, muslins, fine cottons, and so on. It also, there's a lot of scholarship that's demonstrated the size, extent, and reach of the export market for India's textiles. Well, I've even come across accounts in British literature in the 17th and 18th centuries of British shopkeepers trying to pass off shoddy European-made cloth as made in India, because made in India was the hallmark for high quality. It was Indian clothing and textiles, or what the aristocracy of Europe, from the Palace of Versailles to the Court of St. James, were wearing. Now, the British came in. Obviously, they're not going to be able to succeed to sell their cloth to people who were making the world's best cloth. So they proceeded to attack and destroy this industry. And I've given far more detail in the book than I can in the talk, but right down to actually physically breaking the looms of the weavers. In one notorious incident recorded by a Dutch observer at the time, chopping off the thumbs of weavers so they couldn't weave again if their looms were repaired, imposing punitive tariffs and duties on Indian cloth so it couldn't be exported easily or affordably, and lifting tariffs and duties on the import of British cloth, which then began to swamp the market. This is simply one example where, in the name of free trade, the existing free trade of Indian industry was destroyed in order to impose British trade on the Indians. You had similar stories in other areas. India was a major shipbuilding country. In fact, when the British first conquered large chunks of Bengal and other port areas in eastern India, they actually were quite happy to have conquered these big places of shipbuilding because Indian ships were simply better than European ships. They were made to higher standards of craftsmanship, and the wood that was used, mahogany or teak, tended to last much longer than the fir or pine with which European ships were made. In the first decade of the 19th century, for example, the average European ship had a lifespan of just 7 to 10 years, whereas the average Indian ship had a lifespan of over 25 years. So even British ship owners said, let's make our ships in India and do better that way. That, of course, created other complications because it started throwing shipwrights and plowrights and dockyard workers out of work in London. And quickly enough, the British passed a law that forbade ships made in India from plying the lucrative trade routes to London, thereby removing any incentive for British ship owners to make their ships in India. And having restricted these ships just to local coastal trade up and down the Indian coast, essentially drove the Indian shipbuilding business into extinction. And a third example was Indian steel. India was a progenitor of highly sophisticated metallurgy going back again a few thousand years. But a particular Indian steel had become the byword for high-quality steel in the world. It was known as Wotz steel, W-O-T-Z, which sounds vaguely Polish, but it wasn't actually. It was a European mangling of the Kannada word ukka. Ukka steel was the name. It was invented in what is today Karnataka. And this steel was so good that the Arabs came in the 10th century and learned the technology to manufacture what became known as the famous Damascus steel. And it is documented that in the early days of the British conquest of India, when British soldiers killed Indians, sepoys, or whatever you wanted to call them, Indian soldiers, they dismounted to steal the sword of the man they had killed, because the swords of the Indian soldiers were made with so much higher quality steel than anything that a European soldier could have in his scabbard. So that was the sort of deindustrialization that took place. And in parallel, there was direct extraction of loot and revenue through revenue. There were onerous taxes on Indian farming. And the taxes were truly onerous in the sense that whereas the average taxation had been about 15% of the crop through most recorded periods of Indian history, and whenever any particular landlord or any Mughal ruler took it up to something like 40 or 45, there was outrage expressed at the rapacity of the rulers. The British routinely taxed at levels approximating 85 and 90% of the taxes, and they used to exact these taxes through the most extraordinary tortures, which have been documented and talked about at length at the time. And what is more, people started voting with their feet. The peasants in British-controlled lands started fleeing in the late 18th century to lands controlled by Indian princes, because there still were lands in those days the British hadn't fully occupied or dominated. And when accounts of how the British were exploiting the Indian peasantry were provided in the famous debates in the House of Commons in the 1780s during the impeachment of British Governor-General Warren Hastings for corruption in the House of Commons, the details were so graphic and painful that the playwright Sheridan's wife is said to have swooned in the visitors' gallery had to be carried out with smelling salts. So horrific were the details of the tortures the British imposed on the Indian peasantry. More interestingly enough, they actually kept meticulous accounts of all the money they collected and sent back to England, which was the other aspect of the problem. Because whereas, first of all, Indian rulers tended to be Indian and therefore fairly flexible, which meant that if, for example, there was a drought or there was a tragedy in the peasant's family, or for that matter, a happy occasion, a wedding in the family, taxes were either waived or reduced or postponed by, if you like, cultural habit in India, whereas the British prided themselves on doing everything by the book. By the book. And so there were no exceptions made. The book said this is what you had to pay, and it didn't matter whether you just lost your father or your child, or if you'd just celebrated, blown up all your savings and marrying off your daughter, whatever it was. No excuses. This is it. If it's a drought, it doesn't matter. All the more reason why you have to pay, because our revenues go down in the drought. And that was the British approach. And then they would, unlike, again, some of the exploitative Indian rulers who at least spent the money they extracted from the peasantry on local improvements, roads, highways, palaces, bridges, whatever it was, the British didn't invest in local improvements. They sent the money back to Britain, and they kept detailed accounts. So that one of the interesting things about how easy it is to indict the British is because most of the facts and figures you use for British atrocities come from British sources. They maintained the accounts every year. All of this was completely publicly available. In writing my book, I was able to pore over a House of Commons testimonies in which the British themselves were talking about the stark realities of British rule in India. So I didn't need to look for nationalist sources when the British accounts of what went on with themselves so clearly self-inculpating, as it were, of what had gone wrong during British rule. I talked about famines, and I mentioned that example because people have tended to believe, largely as a result of late Victorian British propaganda, that famines are somehow endemic to India and that Indians are always dying like flies of starvation. Well, I think you have to know that is simply not true. There was not only a very different management of agricultural resources in India, but famines were actually caused and sustained by deliberate British policy, both in India and, I might add, in Ireland, as we know from the potato blight of the 1840s, where the British approached famines through the same approach. And the approach was predicated on three principles. The first was the Adam-Smithian principle, if you like, that the free market must always prevail. So if a drought occurred, in the old days, the Indians would immediately compensate for the drought, reduce or abolish taxes, give charity. People rallied together, gave alms to the hungry, etc. And in any case, whatever little grain was there was available locally in that area. When the British came, during droughts, they were taking the available grain and sending it back to London for the bread baskets of Britain. And they said that's the rule of the market. You know, those who can take the grain, the rules of the market will prevail. We will take it. And if that means that what little grain is left is not affordable for the poor, tough, that's market economics for you. That was principle number one. Principle number two was that charity is always bad, that it encourages idleness. This is an attitude that continued. Many of you who have read Charles Dickens know about the attitudes in the workhouses and so on. This was very much the attitude right through most of the 19th century. Charity was bad. Therefore, you shall not give any. And in fact, it was so strongly disapproved of by the British that I recount an episode during the Orissa famine of 1866 when a Mr. McMinn, who I assume was either Irish or Scottish, moved by the plight of people starving before his very eyes, tried to give some food to them and was severely reprimanded by the British officials who said that if you continue doing this, we will ship you back home, because you're not supposed to be giving charity to dying Indians. If they don't have food, let them die. That was official policy. And the third principle, of course, is good Victorian fiscal prudence. Thou shalt not spend money thou hast not budgeted for. And, of course, you never budget for a famine. So the result is that the British, by actually worsening conditions during a drought, by prohibiting charity and by purchasing and shipping out the grain that was available, essentially created the famine, created the phenomenon of people dying. I mean, the shock to the system was in the very first famine under British rule in Bengal in the 1770s, when a third of the population, of the entire population of Bengal, perished because they'd never seen anything like this. Rulers who, instead of giving grain, were taking it away and were refusing to allow charity to be provided. And this carried on, sadly, rather late, because though by the late 19th century, the Victorians had developed a conscience, and there were at least a popular press that were beginning to decry these appalling policies. The fact is that the policies continued. The Orissa famine I mentioned was the 1860s. There were famines in the 1870s in southern India, famines, very bad famines in the 1890s. And the British, because of the public attitude in Britain towards the sense of responsibility, the British had essentially, after the revolt in India in the 1850s against their rule, had been trying to sell this myth, not least to their own public, that they were actually ruling in India for the good of the Indians. The public began to hold them to it. And the free press, of course, thank you for that. The free press was, of course, suggesting that, that something needed to be done. And so they did. They set up work camps. But what's absolutely striking is that the rations provided in these work camps are people who had to work. Still not idle charity. They had to work, however starving they were, for whatever grain they got. The rations provided were lower, in the estimate of a British scholar, Professor Mike Davies, who wrote a painful book called Late Victorian Holocaust about this, were lower than the rations given by the Nazis to the concentration camp inmates in Buchenwald before gassing them to death. So that was how British charity, such as it was, operated. Now, in Ireland, there wasn't even any pretense of charity, and that's why in the 1840s so many Irish died, and so many others hopped onto ships and sailed off to America. But in India, there wasn't that option. You didn't have ships that would take you to America, so you ended up essentially dying. Now, in the 1940s, we had a reprise of this horrendous thing when Winston Churchill decided that when the drought and the famine broke out in Bengal in 1943, that instead of leaving grain in the markets there, that grain would be removed from Bengal and sent off to Europe, not to immediately aid in the war effort. World War II was going on at the time, but to bolster buffer stocks, reserve stocks, to be held in the event of a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia, which didn't happen till late 1944 anyway. But so the grain went off, and the usual British attitudes kicked in. Ships laden with wheat from Australia were calling at Calcutta port for refueling before carrying on, and they could have easily disembarked their wheat, and indeed a proposal was made that they should. But Churchill personally decided they would not do so. The starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis matters much less than that of sturdy Tommies, he said. Sturdy Greeks, I beg your pardon, he said, quote unquote. He was told that people were dying because of his decisions, and he said, "Oh, I hate Indians anyway. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion." Another exact quote is, "It's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits." This was the kind of attitude that Churchill had to what ended up being 4.3 million human beings dying between October 43 and about March of 44 in Bengal. And when conscience-stricken British officials in Calcutta sent a formal memorandum to the Prime Minister protesting these policies and saying people were dying because of them, all Churchill could bring himself to do was to write in the margin of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British expect the rest of the world to hail as the apostle of freedom and democracy, when we know him as really very, very little different from the likes of some of the worst genocidal dictators of the 20th century. There is a difference of degree. Hitler gassed 6 million, Churchill killed 4.3, but essentially it comes down to a difference of numbers and not in terms of human quality. I wanted to leave time for questions and answers. I will end with one more atrocity. I've left out lots and lots of things which I hope to address in the Q&A. But and in particular, one of the things that I find often interesting to talk to, so if it interests you, by all means ask, is those apologists for the empire say, well, all right, everything you say is true and verifiable and documented, but they say, surely the British did lots of good. They left behind railways, they gave you rule of law and democracy and all of these wonderful things. To which my answer is the British didn't leave one thing behind that they brought to India for the good of Indians. Every single thing that apologists for the empire point to today was brought in to serve British interests, to perpetuate British control, or most often to enhance British profits. That's what so the railways, for example, were not brought in for the good of India. They were explicitly brought in order to extract resources from the interior and take them to the ports to send them off to England, or to send troops into the interior to quell any restive trouble in the hinterland. And even the building of the railways was a gigantic colonial scam in which profits were guaranteed by the Indian taxpayer, but made by the British investor. So from the 1840s to about the early 1870s, the single most profitable investment you could make in the London Stock Exchange was buying Indian railway shares, because they spent money indiscriminately, knowing the Indians are going to pay for it. And the result was that because of the abundance of Indian revenues and the excessive greed of the British, every mile of Indian railway cost 9 times what the same mile of railway construction was costing at the same time in the US or Canada. That was how the railways were built. So to think of them, and of course they were run completely for the benefit of British commercial interests. When railway and passenger wagons were eventually added for the convenience of Indians traveling on those routes that serve British interests, Indian passengers sitting on wooden slats and benches that passed for seating paid the highest passenger rates of any railway in the world, whereas British companies paid the lowest freight rates of any railway in the world. Throughout British rule, it was only after independence that an independent Indian government reversed these priorities and made the railways into an instrument to serve the public interest. And so it goes. I can answer the other questions of rule of law, democracy, and everything else as you will, but I wanted to tell you one more story, because I want to lead up to the argument I promised to end with about moral atonement. And that is the story of what was probably the single worst atrocity of the British Raj in India, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. It happened at the end of the First World War, which India supported, financed, largely paid for. Even Mahatma Gandhi called for support for the British in the First World War, and the British war effort was financed lavishly by Indian taxes on a country that had already been impoverished by a century of British rule, but they paid large sums of money, as did, of course, the treasuries of the Maharajas. India, in addition to cash, supplied pack animals, clothing for uniforms, carts, weapons, ammunition. Even rail lines were ripped out of the ground and sent off to aid the war effort. But one of the reasons this was done was that because the British said in exchange for India's support, they would offer progressively responsible self-government at the end of the war, by which Indian opinion understood dominion status, like the status enjoyed by the so-called White Commonwealth, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, and so on, who had the Queen as the head of their state, but who ran their own affairs with their own elected leaders. But to cut a long story short, that never happened. Perfidious Albion broke its word, and instead of granting more freedoms, it actually withdrew such freedoms as did exist, reimposed wartime-era restrictions on freedom of assembly, freedom of opinion, freedom of the press, and so on. Thereby, protests broke out across British India, and the British, in effect, declared martial law. They didn't use the words, but they sent generals out to the various parts of India to maintain law and order. And Brigadier General Reginald Dyer showed up in the Punjab town of Amritsar, where there had been a lot of disturbances against the British policies, in order to impose his will. And he did. He arrested lots of people, declared that no more than a handful of people, 4 or 5, could assemble in any one spot at any one time. And having done that, he was told on the second day or third day of his presence in Amritsar that a large number of people, over 1,000, a couple of thousand, had gathered in a walled garden, Jallianwala Bagh. Now, Dyer didn't bother to make any inquiries. If he had, he would have found out these were largely women, children, families gathering for the Punjabi Spring Festival of Baisakhi. They had very little other agenda in mind. They certainly were totally unarmed. They were more of a picnicky mood. And it was a holiday. And most of them almost certainly had not heard about the restrictions. Many of them had come from surrounding villages. But Dyer marched there with his troops, didn't ask them what they were doing there, didn't order them to disperse, didn't even fire a warning shot in the air. He actually just instructed his soldiers to open fire on the unarmed, defenseless men, women, and children in that garden. He boasted later that practically not a single bullet was wasted. Every shot fired, 1,650 rounds were fired, 1,379 people were killed, hundreds more maimed, wounded. He stationed his soldiers at the one gate, the only access point to the Bagh, so that when people in a panic started fleeing towards the exit, they became easier targets, as he himself admitted. The killings were absolutely horrendous, but worse was to follow. He barred the gate and wouldn't allow the families of the dead, the dying, the wounded to come and tend to them. They were forced to lie for 24 hours in the hot sun, many of them moaning their way to death, unable to receive even a trickle of water from their loved ones. He ordered Indians to crawl on their bellies on a narrow lane near the Bagh, and if they so much as lifted their heads while crawling, they were bashed in by British staves. At the end of all of this, of course, there was a huge uproar. The British appointed a commission of inquiry which whitewashed Dyer, but the facts were incontrovertible. Even though the British claimed a lower number of dead than the Indians, there was no doubt about the fact that significant numbers of people had been killed in cold blood. And the House of Commons, even the egregious Winston Churchill, voted to condemn Dyer. The House of Lords promptly voted a resolution overturning the Commons and saying that they completely admired and supported what Dyer had done to restore law and order. And the British then raised a collection to reward the man for his atrocity, giving him the equivalent in today's money of £250,000, which is presented to him with a bejeweled sword, while that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, hailed him as the man who saved India. Saved India for who and for what is a different issue. But this entire episode, the wanton cruelty, first of all, the betrayal of the promises, the wanton cruelty of the killings, the indifference to Indian suffering that followed, the racism of the punishments exacted, and finally, the exoneration and reward. That whole thing together is what makes it, for me, the single worst atrocity of the British Raj. Now, the centenary of that atrocity comes up on the 13th of April, 2019, when it'll be 100 years since this incident occurred. I talked about moral atonement. What do I want to see? I want to see really three things from the British. The first, in some ways the simplest and the most difficult at the same time, is an acknowledgement of the wrongs done through a simple act of apology on the occasion of the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Because to say sorry for something that was so transcendently wrong and beyond historical debate surely should be possible. People say, but why? Nobody in the British government today had anything to do with it. Nobody alive in India today was a direct victim. Of course, there are indirect victims. Children of many of the victims who never saw their loved ones were massacred. But anyway, that argument is often made, to which I will point to two other examples from recent political history. One is Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, sinking to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto in 1970, begging forgiveness from the Polish people for the atrocities of the Nazis. He didn't need to do that. He was a social democrat. He and people like him were persecuted by the Nazis. He didn't bear a single taint of what the Nazis had done. But he felt as head of the German government, he needed to apologize for the collective responsibility of Germany for what was done in its name by those who happened to be ruling it at that time. And the second example I will give you is from last year, when the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, stood up in the Canadian Parliament and apologized to the Indian people for the Komagata Maru incident. The Komagata Maru was a Japanese ship which sailed to Canada with a whole load of Indian refugees and was turned away at gunpoint from the port of Vancouver, so that most of those on board perished either on the high seas or at British hands when they reached land. And it was indeed a shame, but it wasn't the same thing as actually massacring people yourself. But Trudeau felt that Canada had done the wrong thing and that the people of Canada would want him to apologize a century later for that wrong done. It seems to me self-evident that this is something that the British ought to do, and I have been urging this in various appearances around the United Kingdom as well. But it's not just that. There are two other things I'd like them to do. The first, very simply, is to teach unvarnished colonial history in their schools. I was shocked to discover that you can do your A-levels in history in the United Kingdom today without learning a single line of colonial history. There is a convenient historical amnesia where all the wealth drained from the colonies, from India certainly, but also from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean or whatever else you want to point to, that this helped build the industrialized British powerhouse of the 19th century is completely not acknowledged, and that today's Britain is in many ways a legacy of those centuries of plunder and resulting prosperity is also forgotten. I remember seeing a rather lovely photograph from London of some protesters who are protesting against some of the racist anti-immigrant parties in Britain. And these black and brown Britons in the photograph were holding up a placard saying, "We are here because you were there," which is something that too many Britons actually didn't realize or needed reminding. So I think teaching colonial history is very important. I quote in my book a couple of shocking polls by YouGov, which mainly targets young voters, in which young Britons are actually saying that they would like, they are proud of empire and would like to have it back, which only shows that because they have not a clue what it is they think they're proud of. And it's only when they read some unvarnished colonial history that they might get some perspective. The final thing that I want the Brits to do is to actually, in this wonderful capital city overflowing with museums, most of which are what Indians would call a chor bazaar, that is full of items stolen from other countries. It would be wonderful if the British would think of setting up a museum to colonialism and imperialism. They haven't. There's an Imperial War Museum celebrating British victories. There isn't a single museum that depicts what imperialism was all about, what it did to its subject peoples, and give students, tourists, travelers a place that they can go and visit and get an unvarnished idea of the range of their own historical experience. So to my mind, atonement would consist of these three things. Teach history, memorialize the past so that you can't escape it, and then also apologize for the wrongs done. With that, there would be no need for reparations, because ultimately, the main purpose, it seems to me, of talking about history today is very much to come to terms with the past, but as the past. When I write this book, it's not about today. I say to young people, you know, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? Just as you want to know about who your parents were, maybe your grandparents as well, you should know about your country in the last couple of 100 years. So that's history, but it's as history. I don't believe in trying to use history as a club to beat people in the present with. I certainly don't believe it should affect India-British relations today. I think it's something the British need to do for their own sake, for them to be embracing the truth about their own past. And that's the message that I would give. I have an article in the South China Morning Post tomorrow, which is already out online today, pointing out that Hong Kong has no memorial to British colonialism either, which is quite startling considering the number of colonial buildings you've got around the city. And the irony is that there aren't too many atrocities to speak of once you get past the Opium Wars, which were pretty atrocious. But still, there were people from other parts of the world who came here and helped build this place. And it'd be nice to remember them too, wouldn't you think? But nobody in Hong Kong seems to have thought so. So I've mentioned that in the South China Morning Post in my article as well. But at the end of the day, as I say, I'm not one of those who talks about history in order to seek revenge. I don't even believe that you can meaningfully revenge yourself upon history. But times change. People move on. The world changes. When my book was published in India, it was the very same week that the then new Prime Minister of Britain, Theresa May, was arriving in India in order to seek investment in her feared to be faltering post-British economy from Indian fat cats in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Bombay. So as I said, you don't need to revenge yourself upon history. History is its own revenge. Thank you very much. I'll take your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. Really wonderful presentation. And now Q&A. We have about 10 minutes. I know I want to thank you for, despite your travels, to be here. So please, floor is open. Okay. We'll start here with...
There seems to be a mic going around, so...
Okay.
We can stretch it to about 15.
Okay.
At the other end, I can't stay too long, though. But go ahead.
Just want to tell you that it's as upsetting listening to you today about what the Britishers did to India, the atrocities that were inflicted upon the Indians, as it was when I was a school student. But I wonder if you can compare it in any way to the Mughal atrocities that were inflicted, the Mughal invasion. We hear similar and even worse stories I've heard all my life.
Right. No, the history sadly is replete with various wrongs of various sorts. And the thing is that there was loot and expropriation in previous periods of history too, including the Mughal rule. The main difference is that whatever the Mughals looted, they spent in India and they invested in India, even to the tune of what you might consider wasteful expenditure, jewels and so on. The jewelers and artisans of India, the manufacturers of fine embroidered cloth and so on, they flourished under Mughal rule and they disappeared under the British. When the British came, their taste was only for luxury items from Paris and London, and they drove a lot of India's luxury industries into extinction. So the main difference, it seems to me, is that, and as I say, that the records and the account books show this, is that Britain was interested in the welfare of Britain, whereas the Mughals, they built everything from major roads and highways, which the British didn't do in India. Great monuments, yes, there were some for the British, but they were all built for British use, as well as, of course, things like sarais, rest stops for travelers. Mughal Sarai was named for one such, which along with bridges and wells and so on and so forth, were part of the kinds of improvements they felt was necessary in a land in which they lived and to which they bore allegiance. Britain was ruled largely by people who came in order to take as much as they could and go away. There were exceptions, and I've acknowledged a number of the exceptions in the book. There were some wonderfully humane and broad-minded people who came and devoted themselves to India. But for the most part, the British Indian Civil Service was the most lavishly paid civil service in the world. They had a phenomenal sum of money paid entirely by Indian taxes, which included something like a lifetime pension after 24 years of service, which was inclusive of 4 years of holidays back in England. Estimates are that about 85% of their salaries were either paid in or remitted to the UK and not spent in India. There simply was no real commitment to the soil. So yes, there were atrocities in the past as well. But find me a British equivalent, for example, for the Emperor Akbar, who was undoubtedly one of the greatest rulers India's ever had in terms of the well-being of the largest number of Indian people, and who ruled for a good 40-odd years. There isn't a comparable period, as I said, not even in the 20th century. If you were to take the last 47 years of British rule, the British gave us an economic growth rate of 0.01% from 1900 to 1947, and they presided over the Great Bengal Famine, they presided over the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, the Great Depression. The only good thing practically that came out of that period was that the British had been growing tea in India to ship off to themselves in England. But during the Depression, the market fell since people in Britain could no longer afford the luxury of imported tea. And so the British had to actually develop a market in India to get rid of their unsold stocks of tea. And that's how Indians became mass tea drinkers. That's about the only good thing you can point to in the first half of the 20th century.
All right. Okay. That's over there, Alan, and then we'll try to get to everyone. Okay.
Shashi, a brilliant speech as ever, and I think your book is fantastic, even though I think it's a polemic, but it's a great
face
polemic.
From the past. Good to see you again. Hi.
My question, though, is wider, and I totally agree with your conclusions, absolutely. And it's fantastic that it's a bestseller in the UK. We Brits should read this book. My question, though, is about Indian history in India, because I'm shocked how ignorant the young Indians I work with about Indian history, and when my kids were in school in India, how poor the teaching of history was. And of course, the current government is now changing the syllabus and so on.
For the worse.
Could you just comment on, are Indians as ignorant about their history as we Brits are of our history?
Yeah, I'll be immodest and say I wasn't, and therefore I was a bit surprised at how so many Indians seem to react to my Oxford speech as if it was a revelation to them, and they really ought to have been paying more attention in class, was my attitude. But you're right. Broadly speaking, there is a colossal level of ignorance. It's partly, indeed, because those who do study history don't seem to study it very well or very consciously. And it's partly because, of course, amongst the educated section of India's society for the last 30 years or so, there's been such a definitive shift towards the sciences that practically every bright student is going into science with a view to becoming an engineer or a doctor, the usual middle-class tropes in India. And as a result, we simply don't have enough people paying enough attention as they should to history. Now, on top of that, you have the phenomenon to which you alluded of the present government trying in many ways to use history to rewrite a narrative of the past that vindicates their politics in the present. In fact, in my next book, I will have a chunk on this very subject because it troubles me greatly that we are finding history being distorted for petty purposes. I was trying to make a virtue out of the fact that I have said what I had to say about history, but I have no particular agenda today, other than to get the Brits to face up to themselves, their own facts. Whereas what we're seeing with some of the retellings of history, for example, the minimizing of the successes of Mughal rule or of Muslim rulers generally, the tendency to reduce the historical narrative to almost a classic binary of sort of evil, lustful Muslim invaders and heroic resisting, innocent Hindus. That sort of binary is a travesty of the truth. There's simply no evidence worth the name that sustains such a depiction, and yet both in history textbooks and in popular culture, such a view is sought to be advanced more and more because it plays into the hands of a political movement which happens to be in power now in India that wants to feed off this kind of religious polarization. So many of us are standing up and speaking against this precisely because it denies both the reality of the past and seeks to alter the reality of the present.
Okay. Let's go back there, and then we'll try to get as many as we can. Back there.
I just have one quick question. When you speak about this thesis in England, and how has it been received? What kind of, do you actually feel them very receptive, or do you feel that there's a fair amount of defense? What kind of reception do you get in Britain? Yes,
surprisingly good. Surprisingly good. I say surprisingly because I certainly expected a certain level of pushback, and I'm sure there are many who are not happy with it, but overall I've had an extraordinarily positive reception in the dozens of events I've done in many parts of Britain. What has also been striking is the reviews have been almost uniformly very positive. In fact, I think the only couple of nasty ones were by Indian Brits. So it's very interesting that those who've made their bed in Britain feel obliged, as it were, to justify their choices by saying the Brits weren't all that bad. But many of the Brits, for example, Viscount Ridley, who is not only a member of the House of Lords, but a well-known writer and public intellectual, devoted his entire column in the Times in London, the Times, to my book, and said that it's a miracle that Indians are even willing to talk to us after all of this. I was very touched by his column because it's gracious and supportive, and I met him later and said, how come you as a Tory Viscount, a member of the House of Lords, his family goes back God knows how many hundred years in Britain, how could you say a thing like this? And he said, why? He says, as a true conservative, I believe we should have traded with you, not conquered you. which I thought was a very interesting answer from the right wing, as it were, in Britain. The book has made it to a couple of bestseller lists, the Sunday Times, the Evening Standard. Evening Standard was #1 for a couple of weeks. So it has found its readership. And it'll be coming out in paperback with Penguin in a couple of months. So it'll have an even, we hope, a larger readership of younger readers who can't afford the hardback. But one of the things that's striking about this is that it's also stimulated some sincere attempts, just judging by emails I've got, to stir up this issue of the apology. So somebody has issued a petition on the internet. I must admit, the first attempt was made by my nephew, who happens to be a British citizen. You have to be a British citizen or resident to do a petition to the House of Commons. But his effort lapsed when the British Parliament was dissolved. But now there are 2 other petitions out there that have come to my attention. There is an MP who is coming up, an Indian MP, Virendra Sharma, who's coming up with a similar resolution in Parliament. And efforts are being made, I believe, to get word to the British establishment about the importance of an apology. And I'm proud to say it was sparked off by this book. I don't expect a British politician to do it, particularly not heading a fairly weak government, because it'll be too politically costly to go and apologize. So I don't expect to see Prime Minister May on bended knee in Jallianwala Bagh next year, 2 years from now. But I do think it's possible that a member of the royal family, since everything was done in the name of the crown, might want to make that gesture. And I certainly hope if that happens, I shall go around claiming no credit, I assure you, but I shall feel a quiet sense of vindication.
Okay. All right, let's come back here and then over there.
Hi, Shashi. It's great to see you again. I am actually a Master's in Journalism student here at the University of Hong Kong. So what lessons does your book hold for China as it makes its rise here in the world? You know, they also are taking a very important role in global affairs today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, fortunately, the era of colonialism or imperialism in the sense of direct rule of foreign countries is over. That no longer exists. And I think that to that degree, the Chinese didn't worry. I think it's important for China also, though, to come to a reckoning of its own past. I've said this in a different context when I wrote about the first attempts by the Chinese to describe the Silk Roads as a very benign historical experience that brought the blessings of free trade to many countries and so on. In many ways, that is true, but in many ways, it completely glosses over a lot of the realities of what the Chinese did. Zheng He's fleet included a heck of a lot of armed soldiers and warriors in every ship. When they landed, the soldiers came ashore first. They were involved in serious attacks on a number of the kingdoms they encountered on the way of their journeys. They overthrew at least a couple of princes we know of, one in Surabaya, one in Kandy. They abducted another prince, took him back to China. They abducted a princess and took her back to China. They apparently stole the relic of the tooth of the Buddha from Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka and took it back to China. So there were a lot of things that left scars behind in the countries they went through. This is not all about favorable trade winds that China simply helped blow across Southeast Asia and Southern Asia. And I think an appreciation of history would give the Chinese also a broader sense of what they did in the past that may help perhaps guide them in how to behave in the future.
Okay, I think we're going to make this the last question over there. And
Dr. Tharoor, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My question is around the fact that it appears to be that certain countries, cultures, or people of an ethnic background seem to be doing a better job at not letting their people forget the atrocities that other people did on them. What would be your message or suggestion to your own countrymen, people like me and 1.2 other billion people, about how or what should we be doing better at not letting these things just go away, fade in memory? Yeah,
I mean, I think you're quite right there. I mean, certainly the gold standard for this is the Jewish people and Israel, because for them there is a very conscious awareness of their history, of thousands of years of persecution, and a determination to never put themselves in a position where it would happen again. And it's a mixture of both historical consciousness and cultural pride that is truly inspiring and impressive, except, of course, if it manifests itself in assaults on the rights and well-being of others. That's a different issue. But just on the specific question of historical memory, there's a lot that everyone can learn from the Jewish people and the Israeli people. As far as India is concerned, historical consciousness, to my mind, is and should be part of a great awareness of who we are as a people today. That is that we are a product of at least 3,000 years of recorded history. Certainly some of our texts may even be older than that. And at the same time, we are a people who have been shaped by forces of history and demography that are quite extraordinary. I mean, literally, people from almost every part of the world have come and merged their story into our story. Nehru spoke of India as a palimpsest. I don't know if you all know what a palimpsest is, but imagine if I come and write something on the wall and you come and write on top of what I've written without erasing what I've written, and she comes and writes on top of what you've written without erasing what either of us have written, and so on and so forth until all of you have written on top of it. That net product is called a palimpsest. And a palimpsest, therefore, is the sum total of the accretions of the contributions of so many different people, ethnicities, religions, voices, creeds, and so on. And that's what India is. In many ways, it's a powerful metaphor that Nehru used. The metaphors involving complicated words usually don't sink in very deep, but that's the kind of India that I'm proud of, and I think for us to be conscious of that would be extraordinarily helpful, because of course people will distort history for their own purposes. In this book, I talk about how, for example, the British promoted a conscious policy of divide and rule. They had every desire to systematize a narrative of Hindu-Muslim difference in order to make India easier to rule. They saw Hindu and Muslim soldiers fighting side by side under the banner of the Mughal emperor against the hated British oppressor, and they said, never again, my gosh. And so Lord Elphinstone wrote a famous memo in which he said, Divide et impera was the ancient Roman maxim, and it shall be ours. And they proceeded to divide India quite consciously in this way and for this purpose. So history needs to be resurrected. We've got to be able to point out to these, for example, there are people today who see Shivaji as a great Hindu hero fighting evil Muslim oppression, completely overlooking the fact that Shivaji himself had Muslim generals, captains of artillery, aides, and trusted confidants, and that the Mughals he was fighting had Hindu Rajput generals, leaders. And very often military campaigns were actually between a Muslim general on Shivaji's side and a Hindu general on the Mughal side. Narratives of history are far more complicated than today's politicians would want to reduce them to. And it becomes all the more important to realize this. When a Shiv Sena mob burned down one of the most precious libraries in Pune, the Bhandarkar Library, destroying thousands of priceless manuscripts and ancient texts because of an alleged misrepresentation of Shivaji's parentage in a book by an American scholar that the library merely happened to possess. They weren't doing anything more than that. When they did that, somebody should have told them Shivaji was famous in his conquests, that he had given strong standing instructions to all his generals that if they ever came across the holy book of a vanquished foe, whether it was the Quran, the Bible, whatever it was, that they should treat it with reverence until they were in a position to hand it over to a believer of that particular faith who would know how to look after it. That was Shivaji. I mean, and the people who today are expressing bigotry in his name are fundamentally letting down what it means to be an Indian. So to my mind, this is what we should all do, is teach a broader, more humane understanding of our very, very rich, complex past in order to understand why we need to be the pluralist democracy we are, and still are, thank God, in the present, but where some people perhaps are in the process of undermining that too. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor.